After a 2-week prelude, today we're heading into the 80s, an era defined by excess, narcissism, and sensational rhetoric. And while those same words could be used to describe more recent eras, and those attributes are far from exclusive to the 80s, it was then when these concepts became cool. And if you're going to talk about the 80s, the first name that inevitably comes to mind is Ronald Reagan. Much like FDR has become synonymous with the Great Depression and Johnson with Vietnam, the end of the Cold War in contemporary America has been most closely linked to Ronald Reagan. And while his foreign policy approach will be saved for next week, today we're going to discuss his domestic priorities and how Reagan consolidated the undertones of conservatism that had been bubbling since the mid-60s into a fortified, cohesive party in the 1980s. When Reagan first launched his formal political career in the mid-1960s, he did so not as an outsider, but already as a man who had cultivated relationships with many of his constituents. Not in the sense that he knew that many of them personally, but his success as an actor helped his constituents know him. Although this may seem trivial, many politicians' greatest weaknesses have come from their inability to connect with the voting populace. Luckily for Reagan, he didn't have that problem. In the late 40s and early 50s, Reagan served as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a union for actors in Hollywood, and was a Democrat until he changed his party affiliation in 1962. Although glimpses of his hardline foreign policy could be seen as early as in the 1950s, when he worked for GE and routinely spoke of his abhorrence for communism. Following a nationally televised and positively accepted speech at the Republican National Convention in 1964, on behalf of Barry Goldwater's candidacy, Reagan, in a de facto manner, had launched his own political career. 2 years later, he won the governorship of California, defeating incumbent Pat Brown. While Reagan would come to symbolize a new conservative tint to American politics in the late 20th century, his tenure as governor of California was marked by comparatively liberal policy. He raised taxes in order to tackle a budget crisis, not a libertarian thing to do, but it did endear him to a number of Democrats, a fact that would become important later when he ran for president. He also signed a law that made abortion more accessible to Californians. The bizarrely titled Therapeutic Abortion Act was intended to limit the number of back-alley abortions by providing aid to mothers whose health was threatened. Nonetheless, the act led to a significant spike in abortion procedures performed in California. The one firmly Republican policy Reagan endorsed during his tenure in Sacramento was his militarized response to student protesters at Cal Berkeley. Using a law and order mantra that was echoed by Nixon on the national stage, Reagan endeared himself to many Californians, who were put off by the demonstrative tactics of who Reagan called spoiled and ungrateful. After serving 2 terms as governor of California, Reagan waded into the waters of national politics and threw his hat into the ring for the 1976 Republican presidential nomination. While he was defeated by President Gerald Ford, the Republican Party had significant challenges heading into the general election. Ford's pardon of Nixon was not popular nationally, and the stain of the Watergate affair would have made a strong run at the presidency burdensome for any Republican. But Reagan's defeat, and subsequent time off in the aftermath of the '76 election, allowed him time to cultivate a message that he believed would resonate with Americans 4 years later. The fact that Carter ran into crises in Iran and Afghanistan only further aided Reagan. In a pattern that would become almost a rite of passage for recent Republican presidential candidates, Reagan's first run at a nomination would not prove successful, but his second would. For other examples, you only need to look to Reagan's vice president and fellow 1980 election hopeful George H.W. Bush. Bob Dole, John McCain, and Mitt Romney also followed a similar trajectory, although of that bunch, only Bush would claim the presidency. While Carter came to office trying to appear as a common man who would never lie to Americans, his likability faded as his presidential tenure became more turbulent. And following his much maligned malaise speech, Americans had had enough of Carter. To many in 1980, Reagan was simply a more likable person. He was affable, funny, and didn't appear to take himself too seriously. Particularly devastating to Carter's hopes for re-election was Reagan's ability to steal from Carter the evangelical vote. Carter, a devout Baptist, had taken much of the South in '76 due to his religious common ground with Southern whites and pro-civil rights agenda with African Americans. But 4 years later, Carter not only didn't win a majority of the South, he took only 49 electoral votes. But despite Reagan's ability to court the religious right, his own personal history didn't seem consistent with the evangelical mindset. Reagan was divorced, was not a regular churchgoer, and signed a law liberalizing abortion. These facts helped contribute to Reagan's legacy as the Teflon president, meaning nothing negative would stick to him and have a lasting negative legacy. Even when he made comments as asinine as suggesting that pollution comes from trees, or talking about his experiences in World War II, when really he played a character in a World War II film, people shrugged it off as just Reagan being Reagan, a figurative Kevlar vest that would serve him well during his presidency. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing the lecture. During the 1980 election cycle, Reagan was outspoken about his desire to reform a broken economic system. He promised to end the age of stagflation that had dominated the late 1970s, meaning high inflation, low wages, as well as high unemployment rate, and reform a tax code he deemed punitive. Also on the campaign trail, he pledged to balance the federal budget, but quickly pivoted to mentioning a more achievable reduction to the size of government, but also the role it played in people's lives. And interestingly, although he loathed the idea of a potential nuclear war, Reagan began the largest peacetime defense buildup in American history. This three-pronged approach, aimed at creating economic vitality, was dubbed Reaganomics. Shortly following his inauguration, and thanks to the work of Michigan Congressman David Stockman, who took the reins of the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, the president unveiled the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. The act aimed to slash tax rates across the board, but was most advantageous to high-income earners. During the early stages of the Cold War, the highest marginal tax rate had topped 90%, and by the late 70s was still hovering around 70%. IRTA, as the law was called, slashed the top tax rate from 70% to 50%, and subsequent proposals later in the decade lowered the top rate to 28%. When Reagan incorporated these ideas into his campaign platform, it was criticized by opponents such as George H.W. Bush as voodoo economics. In the past, similar proposals had been floated, most notably by Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon in the years leading up to the Great Depression. Mellon had called the policy trickle-down economics, as in, the rich would have more money at their disposal, so they would spend more, and that money would make its way into the middle-class businesses, which would theoretically thrive, and would thus be able to pay their labor force more substantive wages. As it turned out, this concept was a farce, and only exacerbated income inequality. Although Reagan's proposal shared a foundation with the Mellon Plan of the 1920s, he intelligently used the phrase supply-side economics to describe it, instead of the tainted trickle-down phrase. In the picture at the bottom of the slide, you'll be able to see a chart Reagan used to help people visualize his program. Of course, Reagan would have difficulty selling an idea to the masses that really was disproportionately beneficial to the wealthy, so he used an average family salary as the model. However, the lack of figures, the simplicity of the chart, not including any sort of rational scale was brilliant. In an attempt to simplify ideas, Reagan never tried to elevate his rhetoric out of fear that he would confuse his constituents, so he dumbed things down. Any muppet with half a brain could see that Reagan was promising financial savings. Later, when the president referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, Americans who had no interest in reading up on the complexities of Eastern European socialism could get the Cliff Notes version from the president. Later, in an attempt to simplify his Cold War endgame, Reagan said, "We win, they lose, that's it." And while this simplicity of explanation from the president would be viewed by some as Reagan's aloofness, it was more likely an act through which he was able to achieve some of his more severe social welfare reform. While Reaganomics is Reagan's most visible legacy, the act almost did not pass in the first place. But in another example of his political mastery, after surviving an assassination attempt in 1981, Reagan used the ensuing goodwill to push the act through a sympathetic Congress. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing the lecture. Naturally, the significant tax cuts introduced by Reagan in the 1981 Tax Reform Act negatively impacted federal revenues, making his initial promise of a balanced budget a slightly more burdensome task. The biggest pieces of the federal expenditure pie in the 80s, as well as today, are Social Security, a pension program for the elderly, Medicare, health insurance for those 65 and older, and Medicaid, healthcare subsidies for financially disadvantaged. However, a vast majority of these dollars could not be touched, and with less money coming in, Reagan had to make some choices. Reagan had never hidden his desire to cut back on the role of government in people's lives. He was critical of busing. He believed Carter's creation of two new federal departments, education and energy, was unacceptable, and on the campaign trail routinely spoke of states' rights. So it came as no surprise when shortly after his election, Reagan not only put a federal hiring freeze into effect, but also began to subtly decimate federal programs, most of which benefited lower-income Americans. In one notable fiasco, funding for school lunches was initially slashed to such an extent that to ensure nutritional balance, tomato sauce from pizza was counted as a vegetable serving. When this predictably led to backlash, Reagan shifted his tactics. While Jimmy Carter had created two new federal departments in education and energy, Reagan knew that taking the step of eliminating these agencies could cost him significant political capital. As a result, instead of looking to close offices, he merely nominated individuals to head certain departments who were personally at odds with the program's mission. For example, in the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Reagan nominated someone who was against affirmative action. Additionally, during the 1980s, the Justice Department all but ignored violations of the Voting Rights Act. One of Reagan's most controversial cabinet appointees was Secretary of the Interior James Watt. An outspoken evangelical, Watt's appointment pleased the religious right, while also serving as a symbol of Reagan's views of government. While the Secretary of the Interior is tasked with protecting and being vigilant with public lands, Watt fundamentally disagreed with the department's mission. Under his watch, mining, ranching, and drilling hit all-time highs. Watt's comments in front of Congress speaking of potential imminent return of Christ also raised some red flags, but not enough to derail his appointment. However, while Johnson and the 60s and 70s Democrats were seen as having a platform that was too minority-centric, nobody could make such claims about Reagan. In his final political act, Watt, while discussing the diversity of his office, commented, "I have a black, a woman, 2 Jews, and a cripple, and we even have talent." While Reagan would never speak candidly about race, he was a master of coded language. In an effort to buoy his attempts to cut down on federal aid programs, Reagan spoke of welfare queens, who bilked the government out of millions in undeserved assistance. But not surprisingly, and even though it was statistically proven that far more whites abused government assistance than blacks, the welfare queen happened to be a black woman from Chicago. And because of his platform as president, Reagan was able to portray blacks as takers, further deepening racial wounds. In another example of race baiting, one of Reagan's earliest stops in his 1980 campaign was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a town notorious for being the place where civil rights workers disappeared in the 1960s. Here, Reagan spoke of states' rights, and while one could make the argument that his speech was a plea for limited government, the not-so-subtle allusion to the old Confederacy and its political philosophy was intentional. Reagan's likability allowed him to claim ignorance, and get away with it, when his critics brought such matters up. But the rhetoric intended to find commonality with the racial bias of the white backlash Americans was politically savvy. Additionally, during the age of Johnson's Great Society, numerous federal programs came into existence. Examples included food stamps, pre-K education programs for the poor, and of course Medicare and Medicaid. While some believed that federal funds should not be dedicated to such purposes, challenging the moral rationale for such programs was dubious. However, late in his presidency, in the National Endowment for the Arts, Reagan found an outlier, yet an example of something he could exploit. 2 artists who had received NEA grants were Andreas Serrano and Robert Mapplethorpe. Serrano's most famous work, Piss Christ, was a crucifix submerged in urine. While it's one thing for an artist to create his art on his own dime, the fact that Serrano's work was being subsidized by Washington was unacceptable, especially to the religious right. Additionally, Robert Mapplethorpe's homoerotic work became a flashpoint the following year for similar reasons. Reagan used the NEA funding of Serrano and Mapplethorpe not only as an example of government spending, but a normal practice, even though this was hardly the truth. Again, by choosing sensationalist outliers, Reagan was able to convince Americans, particularly those who were uneducated or simply unaware, that government had completely gone amok. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing the lecture. When Reagan was sworn in January of 1981, he took very little time to follow through on his promise of increasing the United States' military preparedness. On the campaign trail, he spoke often of the missile gap that had widened between the United States and the Soviet Union, thanks in part to Carter's negligence. While Reagan was technically correct that the quantity of American nuclear weapons trailed the Soviets, the fact also remained that the American nuclear stockpile stood comfortably over 20,000 weapons, hardly a sum that could be considered inadequate. Continuing a policy first introduced by the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, Reagan increased funding for forces fighting against communist regimes. While Nixon's doctrine increased funding for the South Vietnamese, while simultaneously lessening an American presence, Reagan focused on Latin American regimes. Most notably in El Salvador and Nicaragua, Reagan funded who he called freedom fighters, those fighting against socialist regimes. However, despite the unsavory tactics of these American-enabled regimes, the American funding continued. But this was hardly the first time the Americans had provided assistance to freedom fighters of dubious morals. Chiang Kai-shek in China, Diem in South Vietnam, Reza Pahlavi in Iran, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Afghanistan come to mind for starters. Throughout the 1970s, détente could have been considered a success. Arms limitation treaties were signed between the US and the USSR. Soviet expansionism seemed to have come to a halt. But when in 1979 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, not only did détente come to an end, but the Kremlin's decision kick-started a renewed Cold War. Reagan initiated nuclear programs that had been put on ice in the Peacekeeper missile and tried submarine programs. But his most significant decision was to initiate a space-based missile defense system he titled the Strategic Defense Initiative. Dubbed Star Wars by its critics, Reagan hoped to place satellites equipped with lasers in space that would be able to eliminate any nuclear threat posed by the Soviet Union. While interesting in theory, in the early 1980s, let alone today, the technology simply did not exist to make this program a reality. Furthermore, even if such technology did exist, the program would not be able to negate the threat of low-flying bombers equipped with nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, or other non-spacefaring weapons. Despite dissent both at home and abroad, Reagan was adamant about continuing the SDI program. The USSR was concerned that the establishment of this system could potentially make the United States invulnerable to a nuclear attack, and thus more likely to initiate an offensive strike. And early on in Gorbachev's tenure as Soviet premier, he attempted to negotiate arms reductions with Reagan, with a caveat that SDI would have to be dismantled. However, the president wouldn't bite. So committed was Reagan to the program that he went as far as fudging test data to make the initiative seem scientifically plausible. With a price tag approaching the hundreds of billions and a renewed arms buildup, by the mid-1980s the era of détente was officially over, and a new arms race had begun to write the final chapters of the Cold War. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing with the lecture. Despite his background as a union leader during his days in Hollywood, during his political career, Reagan was no ally to organized labor. In 1981, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers, or PATCO, went on strike. Under the 1947 Taft-Hartley Agreement, a clause stipulated that federal employees could not go on strike. After threatening the strikers with termination if they did not return to work within 24 hours, the president followed through on his threat. While it would take a while for air traffic to return to its 1981 norm, the effect of Reagan's firing gave new power to employers. For much of the 20th century, employers often found themselves at the mercy of unions. But with his swift fist, Reagan changed the entire dynamic of employment in America. One of Nancy Reagan's most notorious initiatives as First Lady was the infamous War on Drugs. With the influx of cocaine from Latin America came a crack epidemic in urban areas. Equipping kids with the phrase "just say no" and DARE education, while good first steps, were not nearly enough. But perhaps the tipping point in the war on drugs came when Len Bias, a collegiate basketball star at the University of Maryland, overdosed on cocaine the day after the 1986 NBA draft. Tragically, it took a celebrity losing his life for the government to take the matter seriously, even though countless others had died as a result of drug usage in the earlier part of the decade. Prior to the age of financial deregulation, brokerage firms on Wall Street were average paying jobs. But with many firms launching IPOs in the 1980s, an age of new money had come to America. More investor cash allowed banks to take risks that had not been available to them previously, and copious profits yielded a flashy, ostentatious lifestyle that for many was intoxicating. While Reaganomics, Star Wars, and the war on drugs stole the newspaper headlines, one of Reagan's most significant legacies was his appointment of hundreds of conservative judges to courts around the nation. Unlike congressional seats, which have 2 to 6 year terms, judicial appointments at the federal level are for life. As a result, by appointing judges with conservative ideologies, Reagan helped assure a barrage of rulings that promoted free markets, traditional family values, and the value of faith for decades to come. Please take a minute to answer the following questions. Thanks for listening. Next week, we'll discuss Reagan's foreign policy with a particular focus on the Third World. See you then.